At this conference and elsewhere, we've heard some fairly strong statements about financial markets. We know that they're creative. We've also heard that they're destructive. I believe that I heard this morning somewhere that they're entirely separate from global markets. So given the range of strong statements, some of which may be incorrect, I thought to bring together a group of the best experts after running into Katharina Pistor this summer at a conference here's Larry Kotlikoff.
Sorry, you place to take that.
At a conference which she had helped organize, and a society over which she presides on interdisciplinary institutions. Katharina Pistor, from my memory, being at the Ministry of Finance during transition, was one of the major authors. They wrote a wonderful co-edited book with Jeff Sachs on law and economy in transition Russia, and it was just superb. She is now the Michael Sovern Professor of Law at Columbia University and the director of the Center on Global Legal Transformation. Let me introduce people as they speak and allow them about 10 minutes each, and then we will have a group discussion and questions from the audience. The major questions with which we have decided to begin these discussions are: how strong are Russia's financial institutions? How do financial regulations affect institutional development? How does corporate finance contribute to national financial institutions? What is the role of financial institutions in current economic growth? And is the financial system a public good? I must say that in talks earlier with Katharina, I note that she's preparing a book on the code of capital. She may or may not want to talk about that now. Katharina.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be here today and speak at the Gaidar Forum. I came to Russia first about 25 years ago, studying mass privatization and the emergence regimes of corporate governance. And one of my major concerns at the time was that the basic rules of the game, the corporate law, the institutional structure for corporate governance, financial market development were lacking. I'm a lawyer by training, so you wouldn't be surprised to hear that I'm biased, thinking that legal institutions are important. I think my views about what law does and how it relates to finance have changed over time. And what I want to introduce you to today is what I call the legal theory of finance, which tries to explain what I would say is really the genetic code of our global financial system, and incidentally also the genetic code of capital, modern financial capital, but you could make the case for earlier forms of capital as well. I will stick to finance, but I'm open to answer questions later on about other assets as well. So what I want to talk about as the introductory remarks today is the legal theory of finance and its implication for the global political economy. I've developed this legal theory of finance as a collaborative project with other social scientists and lawyers. I do like to work interdisciplinarily. And I'll just walk you through the building blocks so you understand what my basic thinking is, and then I will introduce or develop these themes forward and think about the global economy. So the basic building blocks of the legal theory of finance is first to say that financial assets are coded in law. They are constructed in law. They can't exist outside it. And that also means that law is quite fundamental to how the system works. When you think about law, think about two aspects of the legal system. Most people, when they think about finance, think about financial regulation, the way we regulate banks or other financial intermediaries, things that we talked about in the major session earlier this morning, Basel and capital adequacy rules and things like that. I want to take this a step deeper and talk about the private institutions that really are at the heart of making capital assets or financial assets. And they are basically contract law to some extent, but most importantly, they're property rights law, the law of collateral, trust, corporate law, and bankruptcy. These are really the building blocks that we've used for centuries to code certain assets with legal privileges that give them supremacy over competing assets. So that's the first building block. It's really constructed in law, so we have to understand the legal code, the genetic code of finance. The second element is, and that relates already to the first one, is that therefore financial systems are always necessarily hybridic or essentially hybridic. They're not ever just private, because the very genetic code of the financial assets is backed by state law, and is necessarily backed by state law because you can't enforce priority rights such as property rights against third party without coercive enforcement if you have to rely on that. So financial systems are always hybridic. The question is how much the state does, and at what point the state comes in to a greater extent than at other points. But we should just do away with the notion that they're private financial markets and there's just a little bit of law to patch it up if it doesn't really achieve the efficient outcome that we expect it to do. The real core aspect of the legal theory of finance is what I call the law of finance paradox. And that means that on the one hand, we need legal institutions, firm, credible legal commitments to build financial markets to size, to national size, and nowadays to global size. And yet, if we then try to enforce all legal commitments we made ex ante, at a later time when the world around us has changed, these very legal commitments can bring the system to its self-destruction. When that happens, authorities and policymakers hardly have an option but to relax or even suspend the full force of the law. So because the legal commitments can destroy the system, you then suspend or relax the legal commitments, and of course that's where the paradoxical loop comes in. That also means that you then have a harder time rebuilding a financial system to scale in the second round. So the point here is that we shouldn't just sort of think about law as making sort of financial systems more resilient. They can also do exactly the opposite, and that happens when too many commitments are made that are very, very rigid, difficult to change. We do this because we want to scale the financial system, but they can also bring it to the abyss. Once this happens, when the system reaches the abyss, as I suggested earlier, then one way out of that dilemma is to suspend or relax the full force of the law. So I'm basically saying law is elastic, and that's an observation of practice. It's not something that I normatively endorse, but it's almost inevitable in the way the world works. Law tends to be more elastic at the top of the system, at the apex of the system, than on the periphery. So in other words, we continue to enforce our mortgage contracts against homeowners and evict them from their homes at the same time as we bail out the banks, right? So that's basically the basic observation that I capture here, and you can find this in different scenarios, not only in the subprime mortgage crisis, but in other scenarios as well. These are, when I say the financial systems that we have today, large-scale financial systems are coded in law, then of course a counter-argument to that could be that the global financial system exists without a global law and without a global state. So that might be defined for my theory. My response to that is that actually, in theory, you need only a single domestic system to create a global financial system, as long as the rights and commitments that are created in a single legal systems are accepted, recognized, and enforced elsewhere. And I'm basically saying that is basically the system that we have. The vast majority of all financial assets that are being traded globally are coded either in English law or in the law of the state of New York. But the legal commitments they grant to these assets are enforceable almost around the globe, which gives them the kind of backing that they need to be as attractive as they are. That has certain implications for the political economy, to which I will come in a second. So how does this really work? And I just want to give you a little bit of a sense of how these legal systems work. How come that legal institutions that are created in one legal system are accepted and recognized elsewhere. There's a whole range of legal mechanisms that make this possible. One is that most countries basically allow people to choose the law that governs their contract. These are choice of law provisions, and beyond that, we have even indirectly extended the choice of law to property rights and assets by basically allowing people to choose the jurisdiction where a particular issuer of an asset is located, and then thereby choose the jurisdiction of the assets that it issues. This is important to recognize because it used to be the case that most nation states basically said that for property rights, for the kind of priority rights that are critical for putting financial assets on legal steroids, that the territory of the nation state would be the key factor for determining the law that would govern it. So a house in Moscow would be governed by Moscow law. Land in Russia would be governed by Russian law. The problem is that financial assets don't have a location, and so they're now basically be governed by the law of the issuing entity, and the issuing entity can freely choose its jurisdiction and thereby can choose its law as well. And you will not be surprised to hear that most of the major financial intermediaries are located in London or New York, right? And that's again another way in which we code a global financial system through just a small number of domestic legal systems. So in law we call them conflict of law rules. There are, each country has its own conflict of law rules, but they have converged to some extent so that we have these principles that I just suggested. We have a couple of treaties that try to impose them as well. But even if these treaties are not fully ratified, they set standards that most other countries will accept if they wish to participate in global financial markets. So if I connect the dots of what I said, basically that financial systems are coded in law, that they're coded mostly in one or two legal systems, then we can think of the global financial system as a system that is determined in large measures. So the private assets and the private entities that issue these assets are determined by two legal systems predominantly, which is New York or the United States and the law of England. These laws are widely recognized around the globe through conflict of law rules and through some exemptions from local law that are made in domestic legislation to privilege global actors. We therefore have essentially now two global systems. We have a system of private law that is reduced to two major domestic institutions. We have a system of public law, which are the regulations that different countries put in place. That is largely harmonized through Basel and the G20, etc., where I would argue that the US and the UK are also pretty predominant, but other actors have greater influence there. And some countries deviate from that and impose their own regulations, but they still have to then make a choice whether they want to allow the privately coded assets under foreign law in or not. And then this finally, of course, if we basically say we have this, the public law is more domestic but harmonized, the private law is really linked to two major jurisdictions, we also have to ask the question, what happens when the system is about to self-destruct? And of course, that's something we could observe in real time in the 2008 financial crisis. It turns out then that the system, of course, also needs a backstop. Right? So when the system is about to self-destruct, as I said before, we have to relax the full force of the law. And you do this in one or two ways. One is you basically suspend the enforceability of contracts, and another way is you offer liquidity where no liquidity is owed, which is what we nowadays call quantitative easing. That kind of quantitative easing was provided by the major central bank in the world. First for the domestic actors, and then the major central banks started to give each other swap lines. But not every central bank in the world got a swap line to the United States Federal Reserves. Only a few did, and that was by the discretion of the Federal Reserve. So you don't have a right to get access to liquidity. We now have a system at the global level, as most of you would probably know, where we have 6 central banks. It used to be the C5, now it's the C6. The central banks of the United States, of Canada, of England, of the Eurozone, Switzerland, and Japan, that have made the swap lines to each other permanent. At their own behest. There was no international treaty, there was no legal change at the domestic level, they just decided to do so, which basically means that they have access to each other currencies and they can provide these currencies to actors within these jurisdictions that have access to their central banks in times of crisis, which reinforces again a system that is deeply hierarchical and ultimately linked to the Fed as the global central bank. So what are the implications of that? This is a system that sort of works, sort of. Obviously, it matters a lot where you are in the hierarchy of the system. If you're closer to the Fed or the Bank of England, you have greater access to liquidity in times of crisis than if you're not. Unfortunately, we don't have other systems that would share the loss more evenly. So we don't have, for example, a transnational bankruptcy regime. We're building it in the Eurozone, but it doesn't exist at the global level. We have only ad hoc networks of global central banks. And the costs of the global financial systems are primarily borne by those who don't have access to major liquidity providers in financial crises. That, of course, raises questions about the political economy, and this brings me back to where I started. If these legal privileges are coded in law, the question is who does it, right? Who selects the assets that shall be coded? Who selects the entities that get these legal privileges? And the answer to that is largely those actors who have access to the best lawyers, who know how to code their interests in law in such a way that they will be enforceable, and actually on to choose the legal systems that are most amenable to their particular interest. So the states, the flip side of that is that the states with the most finance-friendly legal regimes, which happen to be England and the US, can attract finance and code and attract the lawyers that code these financial assets. Other countries have less access to the rules of the game and yet will be bound by them because their countries, as a formal matter, recognize and enforce the legal privileges that others have created. So the concluding comments that I have here is that legal systems are complex social systems. They are linked to nation states, but we have meta systems in place that allow a single legal system to have effects way beyond its own territory. And for the global financial systems, it basically means that we have coded a rather complex, highly unequal global financial systems in few legal systems to which some have good access and others have less access. So let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else like to talk about global financial institutions? I think perhaps not. So my second, as pre-announced, Max Buev will speak about uncertainty. He is the Dean of the Faculty of Economics of the European University of St. Petersburg and a frequent contributor to Ведомости. Maxim?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Можно мне мою презентацию? Yeah.
Could you please pull my presentation?
I'll be speaking in English as well because it's just a little bit faster to speak about professional matters. But so when I was thinking of the topic for today, and the topic of systemic risks came up, and this is something that was really popular, obviously became very popular after the financial crisis in 2008, the global financial crisis. But then when you speak about systemic risk, it's actually something that builds up during good times, but reveals itself in bad times. And from that point of view, it's really, really difficult to measure. And as the quotation on the screen from Lord Kelvin from the 19th century goes, if you have something and you can't measure it, it's not a useful concept. But then, basing on what we know after the 2008 about the systemic risk, and there is another quotation from the president of Merrill Lynch, basically it must be linked to the ability of banks, if we talk about financial sector, to propagate shocks to the rest of the system and actually in some sense magnify those shocks. And the question is how to measure it. And this is a really hot topic in financial literature at the moment. And there are various suggestions of what index for systemic risk should be used and what sort of approaches can be used to measuring it. So, two of the latest ones are on the screen, and one of them is the so-called S-risk index proposed by Nobel Prize winner Robert Engel. So it's basically, it's published papers from 2016, but they proposed it about 4 years before that. And Engel's idea was essentially he was trying to define the systemic risk as a risk of a financial institution to contribute to the overall volatility of the financial market or of the economy. And then obviously, I mean, if you want to think about the overall volatility, you need to look at the stock market and look at the capitalization of the whole economy and see how a particular institution can contribute to a potential drop in capitalization. And then again, I mean, this is something that we want to measure in good times and continue monitoring until the crisis arrives. But like the idea is to create some measure that will tell us in advance of a crisis coming that we need to take certain actions. And going forward, basically, the latest achievements of theory is basically to marry up three major things. One of the things is network theory, which was popularized in economics and finance by Jackson in 2008 by publishing a book in 2008. Another thing is so-called Gaussian graphical model, which was widely used by biologists, but to a lesser extent by economists and financiers. And another thing is literally if you start thinking about contribution of institutions to overall volatility or like a measure of uncertainty of the stock market, then you gradually arrive to the notion of correlation, of covariance, and so on and so forth. And this is what Diebold and Yilmaz did in their paper in 2014. They suggested a new technique for basically splitting covariance, a new way of coming up with correlations, like really clever, complex correlations, measures of what's going on and how different entity stocks contribute to overall volatility of the stock market. And for some reason, mostly Turkish researchers do this topic at the moment, but they're extremely successful. So normally what you do when you do this type of analysis, you come up with this type of network, this type of graph, which is really messy, and literally it connects the dots there are the stocks in the stock market. And they connect it with edges, and edges is essentially correlation. But this is not the correlation we all know. It's well, I just describe it in a simplistic terms as correlation, but in fact it's a derivative of very complex econometrics techniques. Mostly it's matrices estimated with dynamic correlation, conditional correlation, Garch models, and so on and so forth. But the idea is that you look at the whole system, the whole stock market is one system that is driven by some force. And then you try to you look at the volatility of the system and try to see how movements of certain elements in that system contributes to the whole picture. So it's not necessarily a precise correlation, but let's call it correlation. And then, obviously, this is from the paper of my colleagues from the European University, basically the paper to be published this year. And it's based on the data from Moscow Exchange. And you can simplify this messy graph and bring it down to something more digestible just by basically introducing filtering. And the red dots there just remnants those companies from the financial sectors that made through the filter. The orange dots are oil and gas companies, and the blue dots are mining and metals. And they are the most connected. You can see, well, they survived basically having some sort of structure between them. And the connectedness in this case means potential risk, because, I mean, if you try to attack one of the points and there is some shock arriving to one of the points, it basically has a potential for knocking down the whole system. So just by looking at the picture, and we can say, basing on the knowledge of network theory and dynamic correlation approach, is that the systemic risk, if we think about systemic risk in relation to Russia, it resides in oil and gas, financials, and metals and mining. I'll skip this too. And then using basically graph theory, you can just come up with some measures of vulnerability of the system. And then you can construct, essentially, again, we are talking about some measure of systemic risk, dynamic measure that you can monitor in time. And this is such a measure that basically shows to us that the system became more vulnerable in the summer of 2012, the Russian system, the Russian economy, as traded on Moscow Exchange. And then, obviously, the end of 2014, the currency crisis of December 2014, and, well, first half of 2015. And, well, the summer of the first spike that you could see, the summer of 2012, that's the aftermath of Greek elections and Brexit. And then, again, I mean, you can monitor that graph in time, and you can see, well, there are three pictures from December 2013, December 2014, December 2015. The more connected the graph is, the more risk is in the system. And you can see that basically that picks up, that methodology picks up systemic risk pretty well. So the graph is indeed the most connected in December 2014. And what does it tell us? Basically, if you start analyzing the most connected nodes, and there are different measures of connectedness on the graph, and the two facts basically stand out. One of them is that Sberbank is the most connected element in the system. So that explains why there is a substantial part of systemic risk residing within the Russian financial sector. But in fact, much more damageable, potentially damageable for the system are the companies from oil and gas and utilities sector. So it's Gazprom and Rosseti Unified Energy System. What it means is still a pretty research in the making, but what we can say, first of all, we have, the good news is that we have Moscow Exchange now with liquid stocks that allows us, using the latest techniques, to come up with some certain measure of systemic risk that we can use and potentially monitor it like on a daily basis. Another thing is that using this type of analysis, and this is, there are a couple of papers published in 2014, 2015 on American markets and Australian markets. So this is essentially a third paper in that streak of literature that's going to be published. So basically, we can monitor the system, monitor the financial market as part of the system, as where the, and basically, as I said, like where the systemic risk is residing, and try to see what we can derive from that analysis for policy applications. And the most obvious, for like simplistic probably implication for now would be for the government, say, to diversify these connections between the company away from Sberbank to other banks within financials. So I'll stop here. Questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thanks very much.
You.
Two exciting presentations on the system and the law, global implication of financial institutions. Koen, would you like to move forward? Yes, I'm sorry. Koen Schoors, we're delighted to, yeah, I got so involved. Okay, Koen Schoors, who is a professor and the head of research in economics at the University of Ghent. And I first encountered his work, gosh, a long time ago, and he's been working on Russian financial institutions since the time of transition. And I knew him also as a guest at St. Antony's College in Oxford, where he spent at least a year, if not more, and is very connected with the world of Russian studies. Thanks, Koen.
Thank you so much, Carol. It's nice to be back here. I will also speak in English, but if you have questions in Russian, that's fine to me. I came here my first time in 1991, and I've been here in Russia since then, every year at least 4 times, and it has been quite a ride to see how this country developed and changed. So what I would like to focus on is not the international financial system or the systemic risk of the corporates, but actually the Russian financial system proper and the banks. And the way I look upon it is, look, this was a very interesting ride. I remember coming to Moscow in '92, and to do a very quick history recollection, we had a massive creation of banks since '87. First, the state banks that became Spetsbanks that were privatized. Then you have the whole creation of all kinds of banks up to '94, and then the crisis began. The MMM scandal in '94, the interbank market scandal in '95, the big default in '98, the scare in 2004, the crisis in 2008, and the latest crisis. So it has been an enormous ride of bank creation, bank destruction, and which brings us to the situation we are today. What do I think about the Russian financial system? I think it's still one of the main problems in Russia. This has been a continuous fight between me and a few Russian policymakers that have been saying a long time, it doesn't matter so much, it's a small banking system, the country does not depend on it. But my point of view is very different. I think to some extent it's the original sin of Russia. By which I mean, because of the genesis of the system and the initial number of crises, the amount of trust in the system has been in the past very low, although it's improving. And it was correctly to be very low. I remember myself in '95 doing research on the banking system. I opened bank accounts in 5 banks. And interestingly, they all went bankrupt. So I had a first-hand experience of how you restructure banks, how you get back some money. It was not a lot of money, it was like seed money, and it was research-wise very interesting to see. But that also makes clear that many Russian individuals didn't trust banks at all, thought of it as a kind of monopoly system, and it was initially. It was a casino system. Things changed for the better and for the worse. What changed for the better is that we have now deposit insurance, we have now increasing regulation, and we have a central bank that has been weeding out the bad parts. And I laud that tendency. I think Ms. Nabiulina is doing a really good job in weeding out the bad banks and making the banks more stable. So this is a good thing. It's you see trust in banks increase, you see deposits increase, that's a good thing. The bad thing, however, is that also state interference has increased. And I think of course, it was a way of addressing the problems. It happened already in '98 when Sberbank basically take over many bankrupt banks. It happened again in 2004 when many of the bankrupt banks basically became state banks in some way or other. It happened again in 2008 when there were big capital increases of the state into the banks. So state interference in the banking system has increased. And I think, although it was at the beginning a solution, it's also a problem. Because everybody in the West has done this too, but then you privatize it again. But in Russia, unfortunately, it just has increased government control over the financial system, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And the reason why that is the case is because in the end, the financial sector's main role in the economy is allocation. So a financial system allocates, I'll wait for a second till that stops.
Is someone's phone ringing?
Okay, so the main role of the financial system is allocating assets. And that's quite important. Sources of growth, sources of productivity growth, sources of innovation, of creativity, they are the ones that have to be financed by the financial system, not only banks, but by the financial system. But if your system is increasingly dominated by the state is, in any country, not very good at detecting those sources of productivity and growth. That's not what the state is good at. So that basically creates a system where control and political connections, which are important in any country, become too important. And I think that leads to misallocation of capital. And I think that's not good news for the future of Russia. It creates stability, but stability is not the only thing you need. You also need progress, and it's not going to create progress. So I think in the long run, Russia needs to think of a way of changing some of the main institutions and decrease the role of the state in the banking sector. I refer in that sense to what Katharina said. Katharina Pistor said, look, you need the government in such a financial system as a backstop and as a way to enforce the rules. But in Russia, it's not always the case that the government enforces the rules, sometimes quite on the contrary. And that creates a system, that's what I call the original sin. Because of this, it's still the case that Russia, notwithstanding its huge oil wealth, to some extent still depends on foreign finance. Why did we have a crisis in '98? Dependence on oil and foreign finance. Why did we have a crisis in 2008? Again, the oil price, but also a certain stop problem because of dependence on foreign finance. Why do the sanctions bite? Because you depend on foreign finance. But there's so much riches in Russia. Why isn't the financial system able itself to collect the savings of the Russian population and reallocate them to the private sector and create productivity and growth? The reason is, I think, institutions and too much government interference in the banking system. So I think there are in a way, great prospects, because if you do this reform correctly, the proceeds are going to be enormous.
Thanks very much. Professor Kolodko, would you care to go next? Okay, yeah. We are delighted to have with Professor Grzegorz Kolodko, who was the former Minister of Finance in Poland, and he is also director of the project of transformation, integration, globalization, and economic research called TIGER at Kozminski University. Thanks for joining us. Great to have you.
Здравствуйте, я тоже буду говорить на английском.
I'm going to speak English too in my presentation.
Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister for Economy 4 times in 4 different governments, but I was in these shoes because of my academic position. Since I did know, according to the leaders of the country, how to fix the things, they invited me to the government to show. So that is the difference between theory and practice. In theory, everything works, but in practice, we have problems, challenges, and from time to time, crises, including the banking ones, the financial ones, and not only in so-called emerging markets, or as I prefer to call it, emancipating economy like Russia, or Poland, or China, with all due differences, but also in the most sophisticated market, traditional, advanced capitalist economy. After all, the biggest contemporary banking and then financial and then overall economic crisis has been made in the USA. It started in the USA for a number of reasons. And one of the basic reasons, and the risk is still around, and the more so in Russia than in the US, the more so in China than in Poland, that finance is very much, and banking is very much about greed. As the neoliberalism says from the best American business school, sorry, not law school, but business school, not far away, recently less than before, greed is good. No, greed is nasty. But one of the driving forces behind the financial sector is not competitiveness, sustainable development, a balanced economy, durable growth, but just making money. And this is not only about allocation of the resources, but it is also about the redistribution of the resources. And for that reason, one must be very careful when dealing in theory and especially in practice, in management and in policy, with the financial sector, sensu largo, including the core of it, one of the 2 cores, that is the banking, the other one is the capital market. So the next point is that I would say that if I'm looking for a critical term for kачественные изменения финансовой организации в России за 2025 и quality and quiddity, of course, we pay much more attention to quality. The critical word term is regulation. But regulation is close to over-regulation and re-regulation and deregulation. And this is a never-ending story. There is nothing like perfect regulation as far as financial sector is concerned, because it depends on level of development, it depends on challenges, it depends on the engagement into the world and global economy, and therefore global banking and finance and so on. But the sound financial sector is the one which is properly regulated, and the subject of this regulated is the government. This is the state. But state always has a tendency towards over-regulation because of bureaucracy and because of the conflict of interest and simply because of corruption, because it's a market business. Always there is somebody behind. Is it Russia, which is not as crooked economy as it used to be during the 90s, or is it the United States, etc.? In the United States, we have the syndrome too big to fail, and in the post-communist countries in transition or this developing or emerging market economies, we have the problem that there is still too much intertwining on link or feedback, not always the positive one, between the government and the private sector. But as I'm looking forward for the future of the financial sector in Russia, I think that to quite a great extent, it must rely on a proper architecture of cooperation and coordination between the entrepreneurial private sector and the government policy and regulation. It must rely on a specific, different from, say, Western Europe or Japan or North America, PPP, private-public partnership, but not the one which is a driving force behind this greed which I just mentioned, that is to privatize the losses and to nationalize the profits, because that is what some bureaucrats and some entrepreneurs prefer, but simply sharing the costs and sharing the fruits of private-public partnership. Where our banking sector is weaker in these emancipating economies if compared with the advanced market economies because of the long-term tradition and much richer experience, I think it's first of all lack of a proper financing for venture capital. That is where we are losing the ground, that is where our entrepreneurs, our creative power is being drained. You can hardly you can hardly rely on Russia or even in a country like Poland, which institutionally is somehow more advanced because we manage this quarter of this century somehow a little bit better for a number of reasons than Russia, to provide something which will be breaking through technology. If there is such, it will be drained. It will go to US. It will go to Germany. If you will create a pill against cancer in February, in March, it will be in Switzerland, not in Russia. You will not make billions of dollars, they will make billions of dollars. But if somebody will come to a bank and will say, I know how to make, I have the technology, pill against cancer, they will say, okay, you see the other bank, go there, we are not here. Or they will ask for the government guarantees. So that is a kind of private-public partnership which must be in the pipeline. And from this perspective, to make the difficult question a simple one, we have to push somehow our banking sector forward because, unlike, say, in the US, because this is the history of the capitalism, which is different there and different here, the core of our financial sector is the banking sector, not the capital market, either the stock exchange or over-the-counter transactions. This is the second core, second minor pillar. We have to rely on the banking sector. And banking sector, first of all, is about the redistribution, is about reallocation of the assets. So we have to attract and we have to provide the guarantee. And again, it is not possible to work just based on trust, as not necessarily in this new, fresh market economies as we are. It must be guaranteed by the government. So when I was first time in the government, that's just my experience, one of the first things I had taken care of is what the establishment of Banking Guarantee Fund. That was the government initiative. I drafted a special law which was adopted by the Polish parliament. Maybe you've seen the Polish parliament recently on TV, primetime news, for another reason. Today the demonstration in parliament has been suspended, not cancelled, but suspended. Shame. But okay, everybody has a Congress or Duma they deserve. You have your Duma, we have our Duma. But anyhow, the same parliament, but in different term years, had adopted the law, and we forced by law the bank to commit some part of their capital into the Banking Guarantee Fund, which is protecting the household savings, first of all, to make it safe. We operate within the framework of the European Union regulation, which somehow is being taken by the government and the central bank, the supervisor, agencies, etc., the financial market and banking sector supervision offices, as a leverage. We have the pressure from Brussels or from Frankfurt, so we are able to enforce certain regulation because we are a part of a bigger group where the banking sector is somehow regulated, but I'm not sure that it is much better regulated in Western Europe than it is in some of East Central countries. And then the other end of the commercial banking is lending the money. So what I'm very much concerned, both as an experienced policymaker and both as academician, a researcher, a man of science, it is that during the same 25 years, because of liberalization drive, because of globalization, because of too far going deregulation, starting from, again, the United States, we've got through this financialization or financialization of the economy. Now, the last thing the banker would like to go is to lend money to an entrepreneur who knows how to make better water, drinkable water. He would like to give to make 8% or 10% per month, not per year, or maybe even more. I remember the time when I was in the government when the bankers were telling me, being the heads of the foreign banks in Poland, that they've got an order from Frankfurt or Zurich or Amsterdam or Wall Street, nothing less than 25% or you're fired. So they were speculating on the financial market, which is a part of financial sector. So there was not any drive towards venture capital or just giving the liquidity. And it is really difficult to run a real economy without having a technical credit from time to time. I'm not talking about the investment credit, which is much more challenging and a different animal. So therefore, I think that looking forward, maybe not for next 25 years because it is too long a shot, but say next 5, 10 years, going back this 20 years, you mentioned it when I was here, when I met with Yegor Gaidar, when he was finance minister, there was euphoria in Moscow that you have already 2,000 banks. How many you have Grek in Poland? I said, we have only 120. So we are 8, 12, 15 times better. No, you were 15 times worse than we were, because that was a sheer idiocy to have 2,000 banks in this village, from Moscow from Kaliningrad to Anadyr, from Peter to Kamchatsky, Petropavlovsk, you had a bank. And of course, many of them, they were doomed to collapse or to bankrupt, and otherwise they were absorbed by the bigger animals. Dozen or two maximum, dozen of banks, it's a lot. We do need public-private partnership. We have to give more attention to the banks which will be able to provide the venture capital for a reason for restructuring the real economy to get rid of this resources curse, which is very much cruising over Russia. And one last thing, I think that country like catching up economy, this emancipating economy, really do need a sound development bank. Development bank which will be working together arm with the government to provide financing for infrastructure products, for the great products which are long-term with a very long-lasting rate of return and are otherwise not attractive for private banking, strictly commercial banking, and of course will be not financed by the international banks in which we take a part, which is also a part of this sector. But I think, as we say both in Russia and in Poland, if you know how to count, if you can count on yourself. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Perhaps later you'd comment about the success of the Eurasian Development Bank. Huge international enterprise, right? Not long ago. Can I also ask for more practical comments? We're delighted to welcome to this panel Marina Rudneva, who's the General Director of Budush, a financial group, and I'm told that the English future doesn't quite ring right for her, so she prefers the Budush.
Кэрол, спасибо большое, добрый день. Спасибо за возможность.
Thank you very much for inviting me over. Thank you. I work for non-government pension funds sector, and I would like to talk about some quality changes that we have seen lately in this sector. As of the role of non-government pension funds, I can say just a few words. Today, in non-government pension fund system, there are over 2 trillion rubles under management. For the current Russian economy, this is quite a significant amount. In the current declaration that has been approved by the central bank, pension funds can invest this money in corporate bonds, in stocks, and in deposits. Today, over 10% of the corporate bonds market is on the balance of non-government pension funds. In money equivalent, we're talking about 800 billion rubles. One should understand that in the current situation, the central bank rightly, although painfully, stands for stringent policy, and pension funds have a narrow band to play in. If in the future we see an improvement in this domain, maybe pension funds will be able to more actively work with corporate bonds. What else I can say? Pension funds are quite active investing in infrastructure projects, which I think has direct impact on the economy, and it helps the economy. What kind of quality changes we have seen? If you look at financial organizations in general, well, we have seen a lot of new laws in the banking sector, in the insurance sector. In the last few years, there's been some amazing changes in the pension funds legislation. Over 3 years, the central bank has passed 3 very important, very radical, and very effective solutions. Although it may sound strange, 3 years ago, non-government pension funds did not have an owner. They didn't have shareholders. What has happened? We have seen the arrival of shareholding structures. Today, we have owners, we have clear ownership information, and those funds that did not want to disclose this information were out of the game. The other thing that the central bank did, performing its function of a regulator, it has conducted serious tests and audits. There is a system similar to what we have on bank deposits, and this is a very important step forward because this has created a situation when the market has become more systemic, it has become more reliable. And thirdly, another quality change that we have seen, well, the market thinks it's quite tough, but the central bank in recent years has been changing investment declaration for pension funds towards more stringent level. Today, the declaration is very conservative, and it's hard to abide by it, and we would like that to change. It's clear, though, why this is happening, because we see market consolidation, and there is not very many players still around, and the consolidation process still goes on.
And I believe that after the regulator will make sure that the market players know how to manage money, the situation will change. What's important here for our group, and I believe for the whole market, is that the changes that have taken place in the national legislation have enabled us to be more systemic, more transparent, which resulted in the last year us making the first IPO on the pension market of Russia. nationwide. You know that to take a group to a Moscow stock exchange, there are certain stringent requirements, and all of this has taken place only due to the latest changes. Prior to that, that would not have been possible. Nevertheless, even though the policy of the central bank has been quite proactive and right, the problem persists, and I think we all know that the pension system is always under some kind of changes, endless reforms. Although the efficiency of the existing system, which has been for over 10 years in Russia, has been proven in terms of the management efficiency and even the transparency level of the current pension system, and the fact that the money are not lost, and the system is more efficient than, for instance, managing money due to the state-run companies. So I believe that there are some problems, and the main one is that we have a never-ending reforms going on. But that policy, which is carried out by the CBR, Central Bank of Russia, it's correct. We hope that it will be easier for us to breathe in the future. Thank you.
Thanks for your remarks. Wonderful approach with some clarity about the current Russian situation. Can I now introduce Laurence Kotlikoff, who is a professor of economics, William Fairfield Warren Professor of Economics at Boston University. And I thought I'd just run by you brilliance of a few titles of his works. Many, there are many. You're Hired, a Trump Playbook for Fixing America's Economy. And there's another one, The Clash of Generations, published in 2012. He's a prolific author, and we're delighted to have him join this panel.
Thanks so much, Carol. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is my fourth, I think, Gaidar forum. I've been working with the Gaidar Institute for several years now on building growth models and fiscal studies. But I've also been, been very interested in banking. I wrote a book in 2010 called Jimmy Stewart is Dead. It's about how to fix the banking system very fundamentally. I think there's a number of questions that Carol posed for us to answer in this session. One of them is the banking system or the financial system a public good? And I would say absolutely it's a public good. It's not a public good because there are laws that regulate securities. There's laws that regulate the sale of apples and oranges and peaches. We wouldn't call that market a public good at all. But the financial highway system, the market itself is a public good because establishing that market, setting it up, is not something that any individual actor or business could possibly do. It's got to be set up as a public entity through the state. Now, let me give you an analogy of a public good that is more obvious. Think about the highway system. You have a road system where nobody has an incentive to build the road by themselves, but once it's built, everybody can use it. It's not rival in use, and as we say in consumption and economics, it's not rival in consumption, and it's not really excludable. You can't, well, with tolls you can exclude people, but basically it's a good that the state has to provide. Now, think about the gas stations that are helping people use this public good. The gas stations are intermediaries between the drivers and the gasoline refinery companies. So they're intermediaries, and they're helping us use this public good. Now, suppose that they were to gamble on their businesses, all the gas stations, and maybe they were to gamble in the same way, so that they all went bankrupt the same day. And all the owners left their businesses with the keys to the gas pumps, and there was no gasoline, and nobody could use the highway. That's, I think, a good analogy for a banking failure, because you have these financial intermediaries, the banks, who are supposed to be helping people use the financial highway system, the financial exchange system, that marketplace, and they've gambled, and they've gambled in such a way that they're interconnected. That goes back to the networking that Maxim was referencing. So they all go down together because they're interconnected. They're set up to go down together. And even in the context of gas stations, if you had a large number of the gas stations go down, then people would stop using the highway because they would worry about whether they could actually get gas before they ran out of gas. So other gas stations wouldn't see customers that actually hadn't gambled, so they would go down too. They would go bankrupt as well, and you'd have a complete collapse. Now, what would the government do in that context? What would our government or the Russian government or any government or the Polish government do? They would pass a law that says that banks cannot gamble with their businesses. They cannot, if they want to gamble, they can do that with their own private money, but they cannot gamble with their business. They can't, for example, sell options to sell gasolines or contracts where they guarantee to sell gasoline at a certain price and take the money, spend it, and then if the price of gasoline goes up that they have to buy from the refineries, they go broke. They wouldn't be allowed to do that. That would happen the minute this happened. Congress or whatever parliament would pass a law to stop that. Now, what I propose in this book, Jimmy Stewart is Dead, and in subsequent writings and op-eds that I've written, is what I call a mutual fund banking system. It's called limited purpose banking. It restricts the banks to doing what they're supposed to do, which is to intermediate between savers and investors, between borrowers and lenders. That's what the job of the financial players is. It's their job is not to gamble. Just like the job of gasoline stations is not to gamble with their businesses. So how do you do this? Well, limited purpose banking's proposal, it's a reform proposal, but you could also call it mutual fund banking, is to turn all the banks into open or closed-end mutual funds, both types of mutual funds. Now, if you look at the US, we have 10,000 mutual funds. We have about 9,500 banks. So we actually have more mutual funds than we have banks. A mutual fund company, a holding company, an example there would be Fidelity Investments. They have a large number of mutual funds. Virtually all of these are equity, I think all of them are equity finance, where they will issue shares to the public, take in money, and invest the money in particular securities. So I, for example, could work for Fidelity, run a mutual fund that might invest in mortgages. So I could sell you shares, you give me money, I go buy mortgages. I might buy 30-year mortgages from the public, and then I'm a closed-end fund. The fund closes, I hold these mortgages for 30 years. There's a federal agency that would disclose in real time everything about these mortgages, so it's not a big secret. So there would be a very active secondary market in these mortgages, so you could sell your shares. But for the next 30 years, I would be getting the return from these mortgages. If some people defaulted, I would foreclose on their homes, sell their homes, and hand you the money from selling their homes back to you. So I give you all the income from the mortgages that I bought. Now, that's a safe way to run the mortgage market, but it's actually not a new way to run the mortgage market. It's been run in Denmark and in parts of Germany and in Sweden for several hundred years. King, I think, was Frederick II of Denmark in 1795, started the covered bond market. This has been a safe way to run mortgages, and to a large extent, the covered bond market is a mutual fund market in mortgages. The banks take on default risk, but in my proposal, that would not be the case. The mutual fund would experience, the shareholders would take on all the risk of default on the mortgages. Now, there's not a single equity finance mutual fund that went bankrupt, mutual fund in the United States that went bankrupt in 2008. Okay, we had this huge crisis, we had these different financial institutions. Some were built out of brick and some were built out of straw. It's just like the Three Little Pigs. You know that story of one's built out of brick and straw? So we had this big wind, and some of the stuff collapsed that was built out of straw. Those were the leveraged banks. And the equity finance mutual funds, none of them collapsed. The only mutual funds that had trouble were the money market mutual funds that were leveraged. And now the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is requiring that those money market mutual funds be marked to market, and they're no longer leveraged. They were promising to pay back to the dollar, they were saying that they were back to the buck, and in that sense they were leveraged. So what I'm proposing is that the entire financial system be transformed into a equity finance mutual fund system, 100% equity financed, closed and open-end mutual funds. Open-end funds would be ones where you could redeem your shares. That would be like a stock fund where you could redeem your, you hand in your equities and you want to get your money back. It might be a mutual fund that holds the S&P 500, for example. That's an example. Now, let me just tell you in the last minute here how you would run derivatives, because every type of financial institution can be run through mutual funds, including insurance companies. But let's talk about derivatives. And mutual fund derivative markets have been in place since 1835, when we started having pari-mutuel betting at racetracks. What happens when you go to a racetrack? Well, since 1835, when it first started, you go to the racetrack, Carol and I go to the same racetrack, I put in money on horse A, and Carol bets on horse B. And the money is behind the window, and the window closes, it's a closed-end fund, the race begins, there's nobody else is handing in any money after the race begins, and then at the end of the race, whoever wins, Carol or I, gets the pot of money, less the fee that the racetrack charges, and so if horse A wins, I get the pot, less the fee. And horse B wins, she gets the pot. Now let's let horse A be that Sberbank shares drop 50% by the end of the year, by the end of 2017. Okay, then we have an options market. Let's make horse A be, and horse B would be that they didn't drop below 50%. Horse A could also be that, that IBM defaults on its debt. And horse B is that IBM does not default on its debt. Now we have a CDS market, credit default swap market. All these things are derived on these other underlying securities, just like our bet at the horse track is derived on which horse wins the race. It's a derivative. It's derived on that horse that wins the race, on that security. So you can have all the derivatives you want with no risk to the financial system, no network externalities here, and you can have a system where the financial system never collapses again. No failure whatsoever. It's very simple. The proposal is about 10 provisions that can fit on a postcard. Dodd-Frank runs about 2,500 pages. So we can fix the world. We don't have to have a financial system that we keep moaning about for decades and we keep having symposiums about, and that keeps collapsing. And that we keep thinking, well, if we just have better regulators or better bankers or less greedy bankers, everything will fix. No, this system, the way it's created, was built to fail and has very strong incentives for gambling and for greed to take over. So we have to end that. We have to stop the gambling by the gas stations. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We also have as a speaker Oleg Shibanov. He's from the New Economic School, and we're delighted to welcome him to the panel.
Да, спасибо. Я, наверное, на русском. But as you okay. Смотрите, значит, я...
I will will share briefly about the whole issue of stability of financial system and what kind of research through the banking system let us know. Well, whenever we're thinking about the importance of different components, in particular about the stock market, so what we've heard about the stock market today, different kind of remarks and studies, but we have to take a very closer look on how the financing goes for the loans and how a company is getting money for their investments through different financial systems. In Russia, correct me if I'm wrong, the main financing goes through the banking sector, and the stock market as an indicator could be used for different things, but it's of lesser importance than different components that we can see in the banking sector, in what the central bank is telling us. Secondly, regarding the stability of financial sector, we have seen very good stress tests in Russia, unfortunately in Russia, but we've seen great stress tests in 2014 and 15 with all the external components, reducing leverage financing. We've seen very big drops on our exported goods and merchandise. We know that the output has decreased with relatively good actions by the central bank. It was not like a Brazil system when you come and you begin to entertain with your fiscal policy and you're getting the big blowback on your banking system. In Russia, actions have been much more reasonable and banking sector stability was higher. Now, what is going on? You know it, I will just remind you. Since the middle of 2013, with a new team in the central bank, 300 banks have vanished in the country. And, as you know, it's about 1/3 of our banking sector. Now the question is, what's going on? What kind of banks? Why are they disappearing? Is there any remedies for banks? And what's going on with returning money to the investors? And now we are seeing very interesting components because the input of the individuals and some other deposits have been insured but limited, because it's 1.4 million maximum you can get if you lose your money in a Russian bank. It's a good money for an individual person, but very small money by international standards. When you're trying to understand how come we have these holes in the own capital of the banks, it turns out that the banks are managing to draw up on their balances, draw up some fairy tales, for example, 6-to-1. 1/6 of their balances and their own capitals are just made up. It's about 17%. You get it like not the first priority depositors from what the bank is saying they have. And you can try, based on this historic 3-year span, to see what is going to happen. Can we predict in any way the showing up of holes on the balance sheets of the banks? SMAC, there is one company which is doing research. One article they've written about the holes on the balance of banks, and it turns out that if you're trying to take an unbiased look on the remaining banks in Russia and see what could be a potential hole, up to 50% of the banks could end up, I mean, those banks which are effective, could have very serious holes in their capital. It's quite possibly that the major portion of their balances is simply invented or made up. And the central bank, if we judge by the many statements of its employees, they believe that still the situation is not that bad, and all the bad banks have been cleared out of the system. And here I have some concerns and questions just whether it's true or not. And yet another aspect to financial system stability is about macroeconomic stability. And here again, you can take different perspectives. It's each person's look, but Ms. Nabiullina has been announced by the Central Banker of the Year by different publications. In 2015, Euromoney and another organization, but the policy of the central bank is quite adequate, is quite good in relation to the Russian situation. And stability with decrease in inflation, yeah, there are some details, we could talk about that. although we do not have much time, and still this macroeconomic stability is increasing. Basically, what the Central Bank of Russia has been striving for, along with the Russian government and the Ministry of Finance, is certain improvement of macroeconomic stability, cutting down inflation. I guess the rates are going to decrease, and many forms of long-term lending, including that of mortgage, are going to develop in Russia. And I've tried to now to elaborate on these issues, and this is my perspective on the banking system and generally on the macroeconomic stability in our country.
Thanks, that was wonderful. I hope you'll speak a little bit more when you're asked questions. That was really
Oh
great.
yeah, questions are totally welcome. Yes.
Okay. Let me first introduce our final speaker, and that is Sergey Romanchuk, who also is from the world of banking, as Marina, head of operations, foreign exchange and money market for Metallinvestbank.
Thank you, Carol, and I'll speak Russian, I think, because I'll do it in Russian. Я работаю.
I've been working in Metallinvestbank since 1995. Have been managing trading on financial markets, and in these years, just through my fingertips, I could feel how the financial system has been changing, as well as the lending organizations in our country. I'm also the president of the ECI Russia. It is a part of the global ECI from a association, which is an umbrella for the professional participants on the financial markets. About 13,000 individuals are part of this organization from 65 countries. It was first born as a community of dealers and traders working on the currency market, who have tried to agree about rules of the game, so to speak, and to develop some professional code of conduct. I am now participating with a global ICIF committee, working with a Basel committee to develop the global code for the currency trading market. As for Russia, many of your statements, actually Oleg has stole it from me. I wanted to give you exactly the same example, but I have the privilege of the last presenter, and I will try to answer some of the statements and concerns that have been articulated right now. As the person has a lot of practical experience, maybe more than any one of our panelists when it comes to banking. It's true that the Russian financial market predominantly is a banking market. It's too sad that this is the case. So far, at least we are under impression that we have some developmental delays in financial market of Russia. Since this whole arrangement, dependency on the foreign lending, it still remains, and it will not go away unless we develop the sources of the long-term financing within the country. And let's take a look at some numbers. Total assets of the Russian banking system now about 80 trillion rubles, which is about 100% of the national GDP. It's quite a big indicator if we compare it to developing countries. The share of the banking system is more than with many emerging markets. And lagging behind the US, in the US they have a capital market and the stock markets, which are the main transmission mechanism. In Russia, this role is played by the banking sector. And as for the pension funds, it's 2 trillion rubles compared to 80 trillion rubles under the management. And I guess one of the main disappointments in view of all these changes that have been taking place is that the program of transferring pension money into investment part is being frozen now, will be completely frozen. Why? Well, I guess because the central bank and our financial authorities lately have been doing quite a reasonable policies, not only when it comes to regulation, but also when it comes to development of the market. If we'll see what the program of financial market development looks like, mostly it's aimed at enhancing capital markets. And speaking of the Moscow Stock Exchange, we are having a discussion, and we coined a new term, bandization. could not find a different term. In Russian, we also speak bondization, and I guess we also want to diversify transmission mechanisms and to enable companies to borrow directly from the individuals in Russia and also from the collective investments arrangements. As for the banking system per se, we've been through a very good crash test, stress tests. It's very rare when you can allow experiments of such a grade and scope. And as the person who was inside of these processes, we've been on the brink of catastrophe, I should say, on the brink of what was possible. But it's only due to external and internal shocks related to maybe not very smart actions at the critical moments. The risk was very, very high. Despite of that, the system survived. What I haven't mentioned about the Russian infrastructure is that maybe even we ran ahead of ourselves in terms of how the global system was changing, responding to the challenges of 2009 and 2008. When it comes to interbank trading and risks which are on the market of derivatives, all of that has been concentrated basically on the one central counterparty, which is the NKC, which is a part of the Moscow Stock Exchange, which is the unique financial organization, unprecedented in the world because it's combining all markets. It's the most diversified company. When it comes to corporate management, it could also be one of the best in the country. We have the biggest free float ever, very good corporate management system. But as December of 2014 has shown, it can breed some problems, which tell us and show us that this kind of regulation, the global regulation, and the risk concentration on central counterparties, it's potentially unstable, I should say, because it's a matter of principle that our stock exchange system is such that all the market players, they have to pre-supply the means in each moment of time. When assets change, all the players, they have to have enough money on their accounts. When the market is moving, all the brokers and banks, they get margin calls, and actually they cannot fully exercise because the money can be frozen on different markets. So we've been really on the edge because the central bank had to monitor the situation and enable some companies to borrow, re-borrow money. It's good that we are now past this situation. Thinking of the future, cannot imagine of a bigger shock in the years to come. So the bottom line is that the system has been through relevant testing, and at the same time it has shown us on the global level that the risk concentration still remains. We cannot fully discard these risks. When it comes to trust of the individuals, we've seen ourselves very good through the years, even though the outflow of the funds in December and November of 2014 was quite big, but still it was a pretty small reaction in the large scheme of things. When you think about the individuals' deposits in the banks, it was distributed unevenly, but it hasn't resulted in any catastrophe.
As of our legal system, we understand that it's not just a formal law, and we had an interesting presentation on that. There are some informal rules and traditions. There are also some customs which are followed by the business community to reduce costs of all organizations, costs associated with risk hedging. One should have a stringent and solid legal basis. In this situation, looking back at the 25 years of the financial market development, we still have that birthmark that has really stood in the way of creating instruments for hedging against different risks. Look at the 1998 default on some forward contracts. Russian courts have called some transactions as gambling transactions. Only years later, laws on bankruptcy have changed, and closeout netting notion has been introduced. Slowly, we are recovering trust towards these instruments, but still most international players would calculate risks using parameters other than netting. The law enforcement practices are some of the main risks associated with the reliability of the financial system. We still see some stress tests. There's been some cross-currency swaps in recent years where clients have challenged their commitments to those who have sold them financial services, which was yet another risk aspect. Summing up, I can say that we are somewhat lucky, but that's quite okay. All crises come to an end sooner or later, and macroeconomic situation gives us hope that the problems that banks have are not quite transparent. We see some amazing situations when central banks withdraw licenses from some banks and disclose some amazing information. We still see better forecasts hoping for growth, and we do expect that in the next 3 to 5 years, the kinds of shocks that we have seen recently will not happen again, and business will be more safe. The banking system becomes more healthy. We don't see the situation impacting other banks. Most banks that have lost their licenses have been known as problematic banks, and analysts who work in the sector can clearly see if there are risks associated with certain banks or not. Regulators have been turning a blind eye to that for many years, and this clearly is a situation that we see quite often in this country. Political decisions are made to address such situations, and that is often the solution. The situation is more or less clear. From forecasts for the future, the banking system by itself cannot be the main driver for growth. It will just support growth.
I would like to do next for at least another 10 minutes, and then we can open it up to questions from the audience, if that's okay, is have participants perhaps there have been questions raised among you about each other's presentations. Katharina, I looked at you writing down.
Yeah, I just maybe want to make some clarifying comments. So I want to start with your comment about greed, and I think greed is really a driving motor. And if you go back to my presentation, I think what greed drives the creation of new financial instruments. And in a way, if you think about these instruments as a way to coin your own money, if you were able to coin your own money and use it in commerce to buy whatever you want, you would try to do that. And what I'm basically saying is that lawyers have found sophisticated ways to allow clients to coin their own money and basically do this in such a way that the central bank will be compelled to take it and exchange it for real money whenever the people want to have real money, which typically happens in times of crisis. So that's sort of the driving force behind financial innovation and the creation of new financial instruments, mostly credit-based instruments. So I understand Larry's sort of suggestion that we want to move more towards an equity-based system, less leverage in the system, but the temptation to use basically credit-based financial instruments and coin your own money is huge. And I think what lawyers, when I talk to lawyers in the city of New York, they tell me sort of the way they think about regulation. Regulation is like a scaffolding, right? A scaffolding you put around a building when you're trying to build it. And you're trying to devise new financial instruments that fit within the gaps of the regulatory scaffolding. It shouldn't be a breach of the scaffolding. They don't want to basically breach the law, because then the financial instrument created is not valid, but it has to fit right into that. And lawyers have done this for centuries. You can trace the creation of different types of credit instruments back to the 15th and 16th century. You can trace the creation of new financial institutions back to them. So that's just one clarifying point. Another thing that I just want to put on the table is we're still talking about a difference between capital markets and banking systems. And I think that's not very helpful. I think we live in a world where a lot of financial intermediaries offer effectively credit services through non-bank institutions. And even in systems like Russia that look at face value more conventional, banks that have access to global financial markets or had them before the sanctions were imposed, they would fund themselves on wholesale banking markets globally. Even within Russia, we see emergence of shadow banking strategies, using reverse repos to fund certain debt transactions. There was recently an article about this regarding Rudneva in the Financial Times. So that these kind of mechanisms are here as well. And I think we fool ourselves if we think about sort of these as separate systems. One definition of shadow banking that I like in particular is by Mehrling et al., when they basically say we use money market funding for capital investment, right? So use basically whatever money market funding means, and you can create sort of your own money in some ways. As I suggest, you use that for capital investment. That's done partly within banking systems, partly outside them, and we have to think about the financial system as a whole. Thank you. Yes, please.
Greed or need? This is the question. Greed creates financial innovations, but the question is for what purpose? For what one uses this financial innovation which are being created by the motivation of greed? Mostly not for creation of the additional value, but because for the reason of redistribution of existing values, and redistribution of a very clear kind, enrichment of the few at the cost of many. That is the redistribution. But I think that the creative process is if the need creates financial innovation, because we create innovation because we do need it for a certain purpose, for purpose of capital formation or more efficient and competitive capital allocation through the banking sector or through the financial market, capital market, insurance, mortgage, whatever. And for that reason, we do have also in that weak quality of so-called emerging markets, certain financial institutions, financial innovations which were created by greed, yet people were persuaded, were manipulated that it was because of their need, which was not true, and now we have the problems. You do not have the problem in Russia, but we have the problem in other countries of this type of economies, like Hungary and Poland, where greed has created an innovation in the form of mortgage denominated in foreign currency instead of the domestic currency, and we do have domestic currencies in each and every country, and the good one it is. And this innovation was utilized in such a way that the guys were convinced, being manipulated by the financial intermediaries, that they cannot afford a credit, a classical mortgage credit in the domestic currency, but they can afford an innovation which is a credit mortgage denominated in foreign currency, which was, of course, interested much lower. But there was the expectation of the professionals from the banking sector that the currency will appreciate. At the end of the day, the guys which got this mortgage, they will pay much more than the ones which stayed in the pool of the mortgage in the currency. So you have the example when the financial innovation has been created in so-called emerging market by the gurus from the financial markets, because of the greed, which was suggested that this is the need of the household sector, but actually that was nothing else but an instrument of enriching the few at the cost of many. And of course, it calls for knowledge. You have to be really good in finance to be engaged by the investment or commercial or whatever bank or financial intermediary to work on a desk with this issue. Maybe we teach students, how to manage these financial markets, these innovations, these CDs, all these derivatives, etc. But from, say, a sound, sustainable, balanced macroeconomic equilibrium and economic development growth, it's actually much more an instrument of redistribution of income than of creation of income. And it is very, very risky. The question is only how the gains and pains are being distributed along the time path in the space and in the timeline. Because somebody says, why you are working? Why you are investing in the real sector, having a rate of return 10%, which is not that bad in real terms. If you can make on capital market, I'm doing nothing. I just gave my money to money manager and they pay me 15% per year. That was in the roaring 90s. But it was clear for the honest economists. We do have something like honest finance and honest economists, yet the word is not used that all. That in due time, a priori, we didn't know what due time means. There is going to be the crisis when the other guys will lose the money financing the profits which somebody else did make, because I know also very many people which were the gainers of these derivatives, including the people which were trusted the money to the financial sector. But most of the time, the banking sector is making, the gains, but the household sector and entrepreneurs are getting the pain. And I don't think that this is the good behavior performance of the financial sector. So I would say with the notion that the need is supposed to create financial innovations and the greed is still rather, not a merit, but rather a dark side of the exercise of the enterprise.
I would like to take a little issue with that. I really believe the distinction between greed and need is in fact hard to make. I think most financial companies, if they create something we need, they also do it out of greed. It's greed that derives most of the innovations. And I also believe that we should look at it from a different point of view. I think what the government should do is create rules such that innovations created out of greed don't go out of hand. It's the government that needs to set the rules and the ramifications to make sure that greed-driven innovations are helping the need for society. But they're not necessarily separated. How could you do this? You gave the example of the mortgages in foreign currencies that led to havoc in Eastern Europe. Well, let me give you the counterexample of Russia. Russia, in this year, has created a regulation where if you have foreign currency liabilities, you need a capital charge of more than 100%. Really discouraging this and making sure banks, out of greed, do not take that risk. So that's what we need. And there's also an answer to what you said. I do not believe in a system without risk. I do not believe in a system that could never fail. I think that's fooling yourself. What you need is a system that if it fails, you know how you will manage the failure. It makes no sense building a building that could never have a fire. It makes sense making a building. If it has a fire, you have fire exits and sprinklers and fireproof doors. So you need a system that is resilient to risk and resilient to greed. And that's the government. The government needs to create the rules and ramifications to make sure. But to say we can have a world without greed, sorry, we tried this, right? This is making a system for people on Mars. People are greedy. And the government will have to deal with it and make sure that the greed does not rule out Ghent. But saying, let's make a system without greed, I think is naive. It's never going to work.
Yeah, I think you're kind of missing my point. All these mutual funds that we have, the 10,000, they're all risky. It's just that the risk is not being, if the securities that people invest in through the mutual funds fail, then they lose all their money. But there's no, hang on a second, there's no damage to the rest of the financial system. So what I'm talking about is an entire mutual fund financial system. Any company that wants to operate as a limited liability corporation and engage in financial intermediation, and that includes every kind of shadow bank, would have to operate just in one way, which is as a 100% equity finance mutual fund. There'd be no leverage. We don't need the intermediaries to be leveraged. That's like the fire extinguisher, okay? Excuse me, that's the fire extinguisher not letting them be leveraged because they have no role in being leveraged. That's not required. The government also needs to disclose in real time, have an agency that is disclosing what the securities are so that, and how risky those securities are, so that people can make choices, informed choices as to whether or not they want to take out a mortgage in foreign currency. But if they want to, and if they're informed about it, they should be allowed to. And if it's on them, if they lose money because the exchange rate depreciated or appreciated, whatever happened, and they can't repay and they have to default. So, or they can just borrow in the local currency and buy a position in a mutual fund that's betting on, it could be a racetrack bet on whether or not the euro appreciates or doesn't, or depreciates. That could be the mutual fund, the pari-mutual fund that we're betting on. But again, if whoever loses or wins in that bet, there's no implications for some other financial mutual fund. So it's a safe security.
Koen had a quick remark, yeah, I hope.
Go for it.
Well, never mind, I don't have a microphone.
Use this one.
Okay. No, but okay, now this. So a very small remark. So I believe a lot of the money market mutual fund industry has been created as a shadow system because Regulation Q regulated banks very heavily and limiting interest rates on deposits. That's why the MMF market started, to avoid regulation and to have money market funds to have higher returns. And then when we had the financial crisis, there was a huge initial run actually on money market funds.
You're missing again the point. They were leveraged. They were leveraged. I told you in my talk that they were leveraged. The money market funds were leveraged. They were not 100% equity funds.
No, but the point what I want to make is very simple. Although there was no deposit insurance on the money market mutual fund, when it happened, the government interfered and had to save them too. So what I think is you could try to get all kinds of systems, but they will find their own greedy ways of going wrong, and then you'll have to deal with it. So what I'm just trying to say, let's not be naive that we can design the perfect system
I think you're being,
in presence of greedy persons.
I think
I'm going to have to cut this conversation off.
You really have. You can't criticize me for.
We have a very
wait a second, Carol.
few minutes left. I would like to open this up to the audience.
That's not what I'm proposing at all. You can't criticize me for something I'm not proposing. Okay, it's not.
So much for being moderator.
It's not fair.
Hello.
May I actually? I'm sorry. May I add something, to the last discussion, just about the regulation in Russia, because it's brand new stuff. Центральный банк в рамках развития.
Central Bank of Russia, as it develops the financial markets in Russia, has proposed to introduce new regulation for investment and retail investors. And this was the brightest subject of the year in the regulatory domain, because the main idea of the central bank was that we should limit the greed of the people, because once they come to the money market and try to make money. They make losses, and then they don't go to the financial market to invest because they would see that financial market is like a casino. To avoid that, the central bank decided to just prohibit buying different facilities for individual citizens that do not have a specific education, that do not have professional qualifications. As an example, an individual citizen would not be allowed to spend his or her money and buy some blue chips, even without any leverage. And this example illustrates the changes that we are witnessing. The central bank did not do it in a usual way by issuing a regulation. They have made a presentation, a consultative presentation, doing what other central banks in Europe and in America do. And we saw a lot of feedback. It was quite scandalous. It turned out that if those rules were to be applied the way the central bank proposed to implement them, 80% of brokers in Russia would go out of business. The central bank said, okay, that's fine. We will have new ones, better ones. However, we have seen a lot of dismay amongst the individuals who have become quite good working in the money markets. So they changed this policy, and today it looks much better, much more reasonable. This is an example that shows us that financial organizations do change, and the approaches to regulation also change.
No? Katharina, no. Questions? Any questions from the audience?
So now you
Professor
can
Quiddity?
moderate as you wish.
What?
Now you can moderate as you wish.
I know now that that was well done. Any last comments from either one of you? No. Okay, then. We still have a few minutes if you want. Summation? Turn this off? Okay. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry you don't have any questions. I myself found us covering a huge range of issues, and very delighted that Katharina gave her initial okay to coming, and the rest of you agreed to be here. I think we have a much better impression of both of a sense of law and system and the role of institutions in both protecting and fostering economic growth. Thank you very much.